Folks, welcome back to our series called Tremors, a study of the subtle activity of God. Today, we are in an once glorious cathedral here in the town of Philippi. This building was built by Christians here in Philippi back in 550 AD, and it was absolutely amazing. It was glorious, of worldwide reputation. People were talking about this amazing structure. The walls were towering high, and the roof was composed of two massive domes, bigger domes than had ever been seen in the world before. It would have been a glorious engineering feat had it worked. Unfortunately, it was a complete disaster. Believe it or not, once it was almost finished, when they were putting the final touches on this building, the weight of these two stone domes was so extreme that the walls were unable to bear them. Eventually, the walls began to shake and then collapsed, and the domes came down, and the whole thing was a wreck, and it was never dedicated, never rebuilt. This is a testimony to engineering failure. Yet I find myself strangely relating to this cathedral. Maybe you can too. Do you ever feel like the weight that's on your shoulders is too much for you to bear? Do you ever feel like you're dealing with stuff that is just crushing you? That you're going through and facing hardships, whether it be in your family, marriage, parenting, or finances, or health, or work? Do you ever feel like, I just can't make it? I mean, this is unbearable, and feel like you're going to collapse? Well, I have good news for you. We're going to discover today that one of the ways, one of the subtle activities of God is that He strengthens His children when they endure hardship. We're going to learn from Paul and Silas, who are about to go through something more difficult than anything you or I have ever faced. And yet, a tremor came along, and God sustained them. God strengthens, and we're going to learn how He can do it for us as well. When we left Paul, he had just delivered a demon out of that young slave girl. Do you remember? And she was delighted to be freed of that demon, but she had to admit to her slave owners that she could no longer predict the future. They were not happy, because they just lost a great source of income. Let's read. In verse 19 it says, "When the owners of the slave girl realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities." They're upset, and they want this Paul and Silas arrested. Where is this marketplace that they dragged them to? Folks, this is it, right behind me. This is what the ancients called the agora, the marketplace. It was the center of ancient life. It was the place where business was conducted. It was the place where people came to socialize in the large open plaza. This is the agora, and it also happens to be where the courthouse was. In fact, we know specifically where the courthouse is. It's on the northwest corner of the agora. Let's head on over there. Here at the end of the agora was a massive municipal building. We can see the ruins here today. This was the courthouse. Back then it was called the Curia. This is where Paul and Silas were dragged for their mock trial. Let me read verse 20. It says, "They brought them before the magistrates and said, 'These men are Jews, and they are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice.'" What are they being accused of? All they did was help a girl who was demon-possessed, but they're being accused of being Jews, of disturbing the peace, and of advocating customs that are new to them. It's ridiculous, but the people went with it. Look at verse 22. "The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods." Roman punishment took place publicly. So Paul and Silas would have been dragged out here to the front of the Curia, where everybody in the agora could see what was about to happen. They were stripped of their clothes to humiliate them and to make sure that nothing protected them from the blows of these rods. And to understand the rods, it's interesting, we can actually turn to a piece of American currency. This is a mercury dime. They made them back before 1945. And on the back of the mercury dime is a Roman symbol known as the fasces. The fasces was a bundle of rods with an axe in the middle of it. And the magistrates, the very term that was the one who punished Paul and Silas, the magistrates had their officers hold the fasces right here as a symbol of their authority. The rods symbolized their right to exert corporal punishment and beat their victims. The axe symbolized their right to exert capital punishment and behead their victims. It was one of those rods, actually probably a bunch of those rods, that Paul and Silas endured at this very place. Officers gathered around the two of them, grabbing a rod. They wailed on Paul and Silas again and again until they were a bloodied and bruised mess. And then, after the beating was over, we find in verse 23, after they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. Well, here I am in the traditional jail of Paul and Silas. Folks, it is dark and damp and dingy, and I expect it was a lot like this back in the days when they were here. The Bible says that they were put in the inner jail. There was an outer jail, there was an inner jail. They were in the inner dungeon. And their feet were in stocks. Have you ever seen stocks? Big wooden bars that lock the feet in place. Not primarily to keep the prisoner there, but to torture the prisoner. Remember with me that their back is just shredded and bruised and mangled. And stocks provide a prisoner no way to sleep except to lie back and sleep on their back. You can't turn over. You can't lay on your side. Stocks are a torture device. And so Paul and Silas are experiencing life as bad as it can get. This is a moment of utter misery circumstantially. And yet, let me read to you one of the most amazing verses in all of Scripture. It says in Acts 16, verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. Are they sleeping? No, they can't. But you know what they can do? They can sing and worship their God and celebrate the one they adore above all else. This dungeon became a glorious cathedral as Paul and Silas lifted their voices in celebration of their God. How can that be? How come they're not whimpering and crying and crushed by the weight of their hardship? Where is this strength coming from? It's coming from a tremor. It's coming from the reality of God meeting them and infusing them with the strength to endure their hardship. Let me point to two very practical things that Paul and Silas are doing that we can do if we want to find strength in our hardships as well. The first is recognize the presence of God. How many were in this inner dungeon? There were three: Paul, Silas, and who are they singing to? They're singing to God. God was with them. They knew it. He was in this place sharing this time with them. Folks, one of the most important things to do in trials is to recognize the presence of God. Do you remember in the Old Testament, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were thrown in the fiery furnace, and yet who met them in it? God walked in the flames with them. The Bible never promises that we won't have to endure horrible hardship, but the Bible always promises that if we're looking for him, God will meet us in it, and his presence will transform everything. Paul and Silas enjoyed the company of their God. Number two, not only did they recognize the presence of God, they recognized the goodness of God as well. Are they saying, God, we guess you're here, but you're no good? Of course not. They're singing hymns of praise. They are celebrating the beauty and the wonder of their God. Now, this is so important because if they concluded that God must be equal to their circumstances, God would be bad. But they know that though life on planet Earth can be awful, God is always wonderful. Folks, they focused on the beauty of God. They let their minds celebrate the glory of God. When you're going through a hard time, your situations may be terrible, but God is always wonderful. And if you, like Paul and Silas, can learn to recognize the presence of God and the goodness of God and celebrate his beauty, he can meet you in a supernatural way and give you a strength that is not your own to endure even the darkest night. My grandmother is one of my spiritual heroes. She's 95 years old. She's been through a lot. Recently, she's lost her husband, who she was married to for over 60 years. She's lost her oldest son. Not only these relational losses, but she endures agonizing pain. Her legs and knees are putting her in a place where she can barely walk. Her body is failing. That's what happens when you're in your 90s. And I was talking to her recently about her challenges in life, and she opened up in a way that I will never forget. She shared with me that sometimes when emotionally and physically the pain is unbearable, she finds that she can't sleep. She'll be up in the middle of the night. And she said that she's developed a habit that she's found very helpful. She's taken the alphabet and she's found a verse that begins with each of the letters of the alphabet. All those 26 verses she's committed to memory. And so in the middle of the night, my grandmother will recite all 26 verses, and each of them magnify the glory of God. Each verse describes some character trait of her God. And she said to me that God just comes alive in the middle of the night in that moment. That God meets her in her room. That God's beauty, his glory, his holiness become very real to her. And in that moment, she says, the presence and glory of God chase away the pain and the sadness and replace it with the joy of the Lord. I'm so grateful for my grandma, and I aspire to live like she lives, like Paul and Silas live. None of us are promised ease. In fact, we're all going to have those immense hardships in our lives. That's the reality of it. But God promises to meet us in the fire. And if we learn how to connect with him and see him and be mesmerized by his beauty and celebrate how wonderful he is, the darkness can turn to light. And we can find God strengthening our soul. It's what he does. It's one of the ways that he brings a tremor to our lives.